Well, good morning, all. I say good morning. It is 2:30 here in the UK, and it's been a very long time since I've given a presentation at this time in the morning. And I have my normal working day starts in less than 7 hours' time. So yeah, it's going to be a bit of a tough night, but I'm really glad to be here with you in the middle of the night, and hopefully pass on some of my knowledge over the past 20 years of working in public communication. Um, my presentation is pretty simple, no video, hopefully one or two anecdotes along the way, and one or two props as well, if we can get those to work. Yeah, let's crack on with the first slide. The basis of this presentation is just to go through some ideas about how you can improve your evaluation of your campaign, your activity, and your crisis communications as you're delivering it. One of the big problems with evaluation is it's seen to be something that's done at the end. But actually, in my experience, if you're doing evaluation almost daily in a crisis situation, you can test and adjust your messages, listen to what your audience has to say, and then hopefully get some better communications off it as well. And listen and understand what context you're operating in and what environment you're operating in to make sure that your message is getting across, rather than until waiting at the end and then finding out that a lot of your stuff didn't work because you weren't evaluating, you were just sending out stuff and delivering. So the basis of this presentation then is we're going to look at evaluation. I'm actually going to question evaluation as well. Are we evaluating the right things? I'll introduce you to stand-up briefings, and I hope a lot of people understand what stand-up briefings are, but it'd be a helpful refresher for you. And if not, then a bit of understanding of what importance a stand-up briefing can bring. Atmospherics as well, and again, one or two little atmospheric anecdotes along the way, how listening to your audience can really help your understanding of your presentation and your communications. And then, you know, finally, just have a little bit of a sum up about some of the lessons identified. And there's some people don't like lessons learned. I'd like to think that actually evaluation now is lessons learned in its proper sense, as opposed to just identifying lessons, putting them in a drawer and moving on to the next thing. So if we go on to the first slide, that'd be great, thank you. So what well, actually, first slide, yeah, so one back from there. That's the one, brilliant. Okay, so part of the work that I'm doing at the moment is I'm a part of an advisory group for local public services within the Chartered Institute of Public Relations. I'm a chartered practitioner and have been for many years, and I was asked to join a small group of be it agency workers, people who work within public communications in the UK, just to act as a little bit of a sounding board for COVID-19. So biggest crisis we've had in a long time, lots of government agencies, whole UK approach getting involved, the health sector, social care sector, local authorities, local councils, right the way down to even just community bodies, all engaged in a health and safety message, but also now return to some sense of normality. So part of my work at the moment is to listen, to advise on where the story is going, also to challenge some of the things that government's coming out with as well through this advisory group. And part of that work was actually 2 or 3 weeks ago with a colleague of mine, Amanda Coleman, who is ex-Greater Manchester Police Communications. We co-wrote a paper on stand-up briefings and the importance of them for people who had not necessarily done them before. So we looked at some of our lessons identified from working with the police, myself with the military and the emergency services, to build up a little bit of a cheat sheet and a check sheet for people who may not have done sort of daily stand-up briefings. And I'll pull out some of that a little bit later on. So that was just bringing together knowledge of the public sector, as well as a paper which has been published now by the CIPR, which if you Google CIPR local public services, you'll be able to find that document for yourself. So if we go on to the next slide then. So This is one of my favorite graphics. It was modified from a graphic from a few years ago, and it's Gaping Void, at Gaping Void, well worth a follow on Twitter. Hugh Kearns has been doing that work there. He's been drawing on the back of business cards for absolutely years, and then put together this brilliant graphic about knowledge and how it's all connected. And a few years ago, he then put the impact piece on the end. Just like, this is brilliant. This is how to do evaluation. This is amazing. So that graphic you see popping up in evaluation circles quite a lot now, about nodes of information, joining them all together through knowledge into now impact. And impact definitely is a bit of a golden egg, I'm afraid. Measuring impact is really, really difficult. And evaluation frameworks may not be hitting that as well as we could imagine at the moment. Certainly in science circles, my job right now is head of communications for a science organization. Scientists working on the impact of their papers is a really big deal for them, and it's very qualitative and very statement heavy, very word heavy. So scientists also have a vested interest, but also quite difficult time in measuring impact. And I can agree with that as certainly a public sector communicator, because impact is what we're trying to deliver. It's not just about value for money, it is actually about changing people's lives. So the what and the why of evaluation, hopefully these sort of A's are the things to remember when we're talking about what we're trying to achieve. It's a real biggie. It's all about delivering insight. And certainly whilst you're delivering your work and you're sending out your messages, insight is really important, because if you don't get the insight, if you don't understand how the people that you're talking to, I nearly said audience, I'm going to try and stay away from the word audience, because actually it's not audiences, these are real people's lives that matter. We need to understand how our messaging is affecting them, how we want them to behave, to think, to feel, and what we want them to do. And that's really difficult if all you're doing is just sending out messages and hoping that they stick. So those 4 A's, are we doing okay? So are our messages getting out there? Are things sticking? Are our messages actually what people want to hear? And if they're not, are we going offside? We need to understand what we need to do to pull people's opinions and attitudes back on side. And then actionable insight. So it's not just finding out insight, it's what we can do with it. It's what we can actually help deliver. So this is a very simple sort of set 4 A's to remember. There are 27 different evaluation frameworks across communications. You may have heard of the work of Jim McNamara, who's done some brilliant work on evaluation, particularly with public service in Australia recently, of understanding context and the way that we are delivering, not in a bubble, but in a proper context. And his work is quite revolutionary, but his work is only one of several different frameworks that we have available to us. The key is actually to figure out what's worth measuring, what is worth us taking out the time to listen, to understand, and to measure, in order to say to our seniors and to our people that we're delivering to, this is important and this is what matters. Frameworks are there for you to pick and choose, not to follow like an instruction manual. And I think sometimes we get a little bit wrapped up in the detail. But also we need to consider what can be evaluated as well. And this comes back to our objectives, unfortunately, those SMART objectives that we all talk about. If you can't measure the thing, there really is no point putting it in. Some things are immeasurable and some things take time to measure as well. Changing an attitude over time and measuring the way that that attitude has changed over time takes money, takes resource, and most importantly, it takes time. That's something you may not be able to understand quickly. And sometimes our seniors want results here and then. So if we go on to the next slide then, so what do we actually want to know? So this is the key to actual good evaluation. And this goes for your big programs, your big delivery items, but also your short, sharp deliveries as well. And these are the questions that you can start asking yourself if you're going to be learning along the way. Don't wait until the end. Don't wait until you've written the program and say, this is how we're going to evaluate it. You can actually change these as you're going through delivery. So again, you know, the "are we doing okay" translates into how is the message actually working for us? Is that message getting through? Are the people that we're trying to communicate with understanding that message? And this overall narrative idea, narratives are pretty new really in communications terms. It's storytelling. It's getting over more than just a key message or just a soundbite for the media. This is this overall story that we're trying to tell, something we've been using in defence for a number of years, and certainly I use in the Forestry Commission. And also my work with civil service charity. We're slowly but surely introducing the ideas of narratives, of storytelling, in order to make the message stick better than just giving out a key message. Because if you have a story to tell, we all love stories. We were brought up on stories as children. And also it's our way to not only interpret the messages that we've got and then try and understand them, but it's a really nice human way of getting a message across by telling that story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. And that narrative, if it's well written and well constructed, actually is something that you can keep referring back to right the way through your delivery. So leading on from that is, where's the story going? This is a bit of a tricky one, because unfortunately, if you're good at understanding your people that you're talking to, understanding the media environment that you're working with, the social media, the information environment that you're working with, dare I say, you can actually start to predict or at least understand where your story is starting to go. Now, I did this a few years ago. I studied a part of the Middle East very, very in depth with a colleague of mine. We understood the media system, the government, how the two interlinked. And then when there was a crisis incident, we got to the point where we could actually say, at this point in time, because this was the key time for people to be watching the broadcast, to be, you know, the key sort of peak time, if you like, in the Middle East. We predicted that a particular video was going to come out at this time. Now, my poor colleague, who's still a colleague of mine in defence, he's still there, went to a very high level briefing and was told he was making it up. Which to this day, I feel sorry for him to be on the receiving end of some quite senior officials saying, you're making it up. As the meeting concluded, funny old thing, the video was actually released at the time that we suggested. Now, the problem is that once you've done that, you get yourself a bit of a reputation, and you're seen as somebody with a crystal ball who can actually predict where a story is going. I can only hand on heart say that I've done that a few times, but believe me, it's not so much about getting the prediction right, but at least having an understanding about where a story will go, where your messages will go in the environment in which you're working, because you understand the information sources, you understand the people around you that you're trying to communicate with, and at least you can start putting together hypotheses and ideas about how that story may progress. And then finally, the really, really big thing, which goes for our day-to-day briefings, it works for our big campaigns as well, is to work outside your bubble. I have some very major run-ins with some senior generals in the past who thought that their story about what was happening in Afghanistan or in Iraq was the biggest story in town. Now, to them, maybe it was, but believe me, there was a time in 2008 when news stories about Afghanistan in the UK media were pretty much non-existent, and yet the campaign was still going on the ground and things were still happening. So you've got to understand the context in which you're working. You may think that you're living and breathing 24 hours a day a particular news story, but if you're not listening back to what people are talking about, what people are thinking, what the context is at the time, then you're working in a bubble and you're going to lose the people that you're trying to communicate with, because sometimes you are not the most important story in town. Now, conversely, at the moment, COVID-19 particularly, that's the one big thing that's happening in the UK. Funny old thing, though, there's actually other things going on, and we're seeing in government now other stories starting to come out. Journalists, to some extent, are getting a little bit bored of just COVID stories all the time, so they're poking around trying to find new things. So understanding that, you know, people are still, in need of information, they're really keen on getting information, there are other news stories out there. We had a story about bumblebees yesterday in the British media, about an invasive species called the Asian hornet, which is being kept at bay at the moment. But bee owners and hive owners are really getting concerned about the invasion of the Asian hornet. That was one of the top stories in Britain yesterday. It wasn't COVID-19. Although back in my office, it's all about COVID-19 and how we return people to our sites. So if I was working in my bubble, I'd completely miss what was going on in the wider media. So context is all. And you can see here, I've got a screen grab of a UK civil service tweet. This is genuine. I spent about an hour or two second sourcing, third sourcing, whether this tweet was genuine. The civil service are still trying to get to the bottom of it as to who sent it out, but it generally went out from the UK service. Twitter absolutely melted when this came out, because it was off the back of a very tricky story for the UK government, where a very senior advisor to the Prime Minister was seen to be breaking the rules of lockdown. Of course, the media were jumping on this all over the place. And then this came out, arrogant and offensive. Can you imagine to have to work with these truth twisters? It's sprung a meme, and it also sprung a mug, which you probably can't see in my light, but there's also merchandise with this now available. Now, we're working in the bubble. You would get highly upset and highly offended by this. Outside, it's been treated as a bit of a joke. And, as a communicator, you've got to roll with it sometimes. But understanding what's going on outside of your context is really, really beneficial. And that's where doing the evaluation along the way and having your briefings on a sort of rolling battle rhythm, depending on the intensity of what you're working on, can be really effective. Can we have the next slide, please? So in my experience, it's very much about working with the military, working with the emergency services. There was the foot and mouth outbreak in sort of 2000, 2001 in the UK, which affected British cattle. I was seconded to the Cabinet Office back then to work on the military response to dealing with tens of thousands of dead cattle. Not the most pleasant introduction to government communications, I have to admit. But I've also worked in a nuclear accident crisis response and dealing with other crises. We had off the back of 9/11 within the UK, there were incidents of white powder being sent through the post. Was it anthrax? Was it not anthrax? Well, I was working with the military side of Porton Down at the time that was involved in some of the testing, along with Public Health England, of this suspicious white powder that was going through the mail. It turned out that most of it was actually fake in the US. That was not the case. And talking to US colleagues at the time via the US Embassy, it was really interesting times. And we had the context of a country in a bit of panic, the uncertainty of what was being sent through the Royal Mail, but at the same time, it was, in the main, it was fake. So really, really tricky times to actually balance that public opinion that, the Royal Mail is safe. There's screening that goes on so that this material tends not to be harmful to the end user because it's picked up in the system along the way. Very, very tricky times. Big coordination from the Prime Minister's office, from number 10 for the Cabinet Office, of the big wheels of government. It was a massive operation. Of course, the Ministry of Defence was just part of that. That's huge interagency working, which in the early days of my career was pretty much my bread and butter. We do have a bit of a cast of thousands sometimes when you're engaged in a really big incident, and you'll know through your own experiences in Australia and the US and others, when you have a big multi-agency response, the big multi-agency communications response can be absolutely huge. And so when you're establishing a briefing routine to actually understand what's going on, one of the big things is actually who needs to be there. It's balancing up the senior people who have something to say and always want to be heard with actually people who can go and do something about it. So we don't want a cast of thousands pitching up. It's unmanageable, it's unworkable. So if you're going to set up a briefing routine, try and set it up with the smallest group you can get away with. Work small, and then if you have to get bigger, then that's fine. But if you have a cast of thousands, everybody has something to say. And before you know it, there's loads of people talking and not enough action. If you're going to set up a briefing routine, listening and evaluating what you're doing, understanding the context and what's coming next, it needs to be small and actionable. You need to figure out the people who can actually contribute, not just do this all the time, but actually go out and deliver something as well. And stay focused. One of the biggest issues is mission creep. It's rabbit holes. It's going down the wrong route. There's no point having a long list of undoable things. Concentrate on the 3 or 4 that you can actually change. The problem is with measuring impacts, particularly, so much of it is outside of your control. Loads of it is up to public opinion, how people are thinking, what their attitudes are, what their biases are before you even pitch up with your story. And unless you understand that, you've not got a chance of actually measuring your impact. So when you're coming together for your briefing, for your briefing routine through the day, be really clear on what you can achieve and what you want to achieve. It goes back to those big unmeasurable objectives. No point evaluating it if you can't measure it. You know, if your objective is completely immeasurable, there's really no point in getting engaged in it in the first place. So again, with your briefing routines, keep them nice and tight, nice and focused, and keep it with the right people around that table. And again, briefing, who needs to actually know that information outside of your group? They can get very, very unwieldy. We had flooding in southern England about 10 years ago or so. And believe me, the distribution list for that information just grew and grew and grew. And that's fine in one respect, but again, it's a difference between who needs to know and who would quite like to know. We used to distribute a cartoon research through a huge distribution list in the Middle East. And it was a really good idea. We had a contractor who would used to go through the cartoons that used to be in the media, and particularly newspaper media in the Middle East, because cartoons can really tell you the mood of a nation pretty quickly. And again, it started out as a really neat idea, something that we could grasp, do something with. But then people found out about it, and other people found out about it. And actually, it was one of our most popular products for a very, very long time. But the distribution list was into the hundreds. And again, you've got to understand that this is a great product, but what are you doing with it? Is this just for information, or can you actually get some actionable output from it? The thing is with your briefings as well, is that if you're going to do this, you can't just do it for 2-3 days and then move on. If you're going to all the effort into some daily briefings, some situational reports, put the effort in and put some longevity into it as well. With the COVID crisis, really interesting with my organisation is that we started off daily, is that a management team would get together, myself representing communications, we had human resources, the senior management and health and safety, pretty much meeting every single day when the crisis first set up, because we were just burst out of the office and told to work from home. Well, how do you move 280 people from offices into their home space and out into the field, essentially? Huge communications challenge was that, getting the IT working, getting people into new routines. So our battle rhythm was once a day, having that senior meeting. At the very early days, we even had it twice a day, which looking back seems a bit of overkill. In the early days, we really needed to get people working safely from the home environment very, very quickly indeed. Now we have the meetings sort of every 2 days, every 3 days. So we settled into a much more relaxed rhythm. To say that, we've got working groups underneath who are actually looking at the returning to sites and returning to office messaging, which will be our big deal for next week. We're planning for that now and delivering next week to our colleagues. So those initial briefings, really, really important. It depends on how quickly you need to get messages out. It depends on the movement of the crisis or the incident or even the delivery. It can be very high impact in the first 3 to 4 days and then ease off again. Always look to how you're going to ease off first as well, because your people are going to burn out very, very quickly. I think we all know that in crisis communications. And so having a high impact rhythm of briefing, of evaluating, can only last for so long. I would say it's only really lasts about 2 weeks, absolute tops, before people really start to feel it and they need to change around. So be very mindful that your high impact briefing, really good, but you might be building expectations which actually you can't keep beyond about 2 weeks. So let's move on to the next slide then. I just want to mention the graphic here. There is a bunch of people who set up a really, really good parody Twitter account, which again has now made it into merchandise. It's made it into books and posters and goodness knows what else. And essentially it's looking at 1960s, 1970s and 80s public information films and really twisting it with a very black sense of humour. And they've come into their own again during the COVID crisis. And the organisation of people are called Scarfolk. They're on Twitter, and the parody account is about a fictional council called Scarfolk Council. The problem is that they are so good at what they do, they actually made it into an official government publication into the history of public information films. Somebody didn't know what they were looking at. Somebody didn't understand the environment. And when they found a picture that looked like a 1970s public information picture, it got published. Unfortunately, it was a parody from Scarfolk Council. Again, that was an interesting day in the office when people found that one out. So let me talk about atmospherics. Now, atmospherics is something that we use in Iraq and Afghanistan. People were out on the ground all the time, you know, both civilians and military, listening to normal conversations. I mean, not in a sort of intelligence way, but just understanding what people were thinking and feeling, what they were up to, what was the word on the street, what were people really worried about, is very, very beneficial. And again, we're using atmospherics even today in my job. What are my people within my organization really worried about? Yes, I can send out messages about how to work from home safely, about how to posture yourself and how to not get neck ache by the end of the day because you're working from your dining room table as opposed to a nice whizzy office chair. Actually, what is worrying them? And it's schooling, it's about the longevity, it's about caring for people, but nothing to do with work. Their heads are full of worry about their future, about money, about all sorts of things, and not necessarily the day-to-day working environment. So because we were listening to what our people had to say, listening to the general atmospherics, but also the atmospherics and context of what people were talking about in the street. I would say down the pub, but the pubs are closed at the moment. But pub conversation is really, really interesting to get a feel for what people are worried about. People talk about what's in the news, not necessarily what you think is in the news. It's about what's important to them. As I used to say to some of my colleagues when I was teaching strategic communications, your message might be the most important thing to you, but believe me, if a pothole appears at the end of the street that needs fixing, or there's a broken street light, that is the biggest issue for a lot of people on social media in their local area. The bins don't get collected. My goodness me, there's crisis erupts. Those are big issues. Having a COVID daily briefing may not be the biggest issue for a lot of people. So you need to overlay your information. People think that that what you're involved in is the most important thing. So on the ground, you know, listen to what the media say, listen to what social media say. But that pub talk, that newspaper talk, that social talk, really, really important. And then listen closely. You know, COVID-19 at the moment is a plot for 5G, it's a plot about the Russians, it's a government plot, it's a plot to stop Brexit, that's the latest one I've heard. You've got to push through this, but understanding that that's what people are talking about, really, really important. So the next slide then, I just want to cover this very, very briefly really. Is evaluation right? It's what we are trying to evaluate, it's what we're measuring. Is that right? Now, if you're in public communications, it's brilliant to talk about value for money because that's the business we're in, is value for money. We have to be seen to be spending our taxpayers' money wisely. But you're measuring effect and you're measuring effectiveness. Stats help you, but stats only help you a little bit in saying, actually, did we change your mind? Did we change your behaviour? One other thing that we don't evaluate at the moment is professionalism, well-being. Should we be managing that? No one measures how important this is, and it is really important. And then finally, reflection. It's really tough. It's high tempo. Take some time out. Take some time out to step back and listen to what you're doing, listen to what your team's doing, and see if you can test and adjust. Step away from the incident. So there's just some ideas about how we might want to change evaluation. And finally, in summary then, never stick your evaluation in a drawer, honestly, if we can have the final slide. Your lessons identified, really, really important. And if you're using them along the way, this means that actually you can test and adjust and make your message more effective. Evaluate as you go, never ever wait. Establish your routine, but manage expectations. Listen, 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 and then action. Get people in the room who can actually do something for you. And then finally, make your evaluation work for you. Don't slavishly abide by frameworks. Actually go ahead and make evaluation work for you. Measure what you can measure. So I'm told I'm over time, so sorry about that. It's the early morning and everything's a bit weird. So let's go on to the Q&A then, I think.
Thank you very much, Claire. There's 2 questions and they're quite similar, and they're asking for specific techniques. So the first one is asking what techniques you can use to measure atmospherics.
Yeah, atmospherics is really interesting because firstly, it's qualitative. Don't put numbers to this. You know, this is about listening to what people are saying, what a general sort of feeling is. So your technique, first of all, is you start broad. You know, what are general people worried about? And this is about going out onto the ground and listening and understanding. So it's about getting outside of your office. And it may not be you doing it as the communicator. It may actually be your first responders. You know, are people that you're talking to worried about getting water? Are they worried about where the electricity is going to come on? You know, if your message is something completely alien or at right angles to actually when's the electric going to come on, you're going to lose people. So use other people within your organization to actually find out those atmospherics for you. We used to use the military on the ground. For me, it's line managers within an organization. They have their finger on the pulse of what their staff are saying. So they're really good interlopers to actually understand, for me, what the broad organization is saying. It's not me doing the listening. I'm sort of directing other people to do it. Now the question, the big thing is because we're a social science, there's no one way to do it. And atmospherics is still really new as well. So all I can say is just have a go. Find out, you know, who can do this for you on your behalf. What are the big questions that you need to think about? Goes back to evaluation. Is the message getting out? And if it's not, then why isn't it getting out? And it may be because actually people are worried about other things. How do you find that out? Well, you go out and ask them.
So you're talking about simple tools like a survey, but being used to measure the right stuff at the right time.
And sometimes it's not even a survey, it's just a conversation, just getting out there on the ground. We've seen some great stuff when people have actually got their wellies on and gone down to the Somerset levels in southern England when they flooded, and actually go and talk to people. And people, you know, want to engage as well. There may be anger, there may be frustration, but, you know, you're the guy from the government, or the girl from the government, and, you know, we're here to help and we're here to listen. And most people are reasonable. I would hope. Yes, people do get angry and you know, many expletives happen, but you will never understand who you are talking to or how you're trying to communicate with from your office walls. And if you can't get out, then you find somebody who can get out and can get that information back to you. Surveys are great when you're in a more stable environment, but believe me, just being out on the ground and just listening to what people have to say is really important in those early stages delivery, particularly in crisis mode.
Fantastic. And the final question is, do you have a specific example of a situation in which evaluation drove strategy, changed the way that things were being done?
Yeah, several actually. Oh, crikey, which one to pick? Well, I mean, certainly at the moment with COVID-19, I mean, even within my small agency, you know, 280 odd people stretched across the UK, we were in danger of just pushing out the work from home, the stay at home message. And it's just, look, the government have told us we're working from home and we just got to get on with it. Sorry, folks who work in the laboratory, that's just a no-go at the moment. You're just going to have to work from home. And the pushback we had from colleagues, again, through the line managers, was, well, this is all very well, but I've got to balance childcare. I've got to balance the fact that I might actually be ill as well. All my research is locked up in a laboratory. You're absolutely sure there are no ways that I can't go in there. You know, this is business critical policy leading research. And if we weren't listening back, we would still be saying, stay at home. That's it. You're just staying at home. You know, you're just stuck with the table and the chair that you've got. The fact is because we were listening very, very early to concerns, we do actually have a very limited list of people who are continuing business critical field work. They've done risk assessments and goodness knows what else to make sure that they can actually work safely. We've now got a system up in place where you can procure office equipment off your own budget. But it means that actually you can work more comfortably from home. We've listened to line managers and the stress of carers and actually suggested that, you know, people who are caring, ease off, give them less of the normal workload and distribute it across the team. Because at the end of the day, everybody is still working on the same projects. And actually, you know, some people will find they have free time. Some people will find that things are much busier. And we found that teams are working far more closely together because they understand each other more. And we never would have been able to do that without that listening and evaluating every time we sent out a message, encouraging people to feed back either to the management team or to myself. And without that feedback, we'd still be saying, stay at home and you're stuck at home for the next few weeks until government eases lockdown. And that actually isn't the case.